I'm very pleased to say that we have Professor Myron Orfield joining us today. Professor Orfield is a law professor at the University of Minnesota. He teaches and writes in the fields of civil rights, state and local government and finances, land use, questions of regional governance, and the legislative process. The professor has done important work in documenting suburban racial change and resegregation, and his research has led to legislative and judicial reforms at the federal and state level. Orfield served in the Minnesota House and Senate, where he was the architect of a series of important legislative changes in land use, fair housing, schools, and local government aid programs. Myron Orfield graduated summa cum laude from the University of Minnesota, was a graduate student at Princeton University, and has a JD degree from the University of Chicago. Welcome, Professor Orfield. We're so glad to have the benefit of your knowledge and experience on our forum today. It's all yours.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. I was, as he said, I was a member of the legislature in the 1990s, representing a district in Minneapolis, and had the privilege of working with the Realtors on many important legislation activities. I think that one of the things I knew is the Realtors and their support and their guidance was critical toward the passage of anything that had to do with local government finance or land use or fair housing. I worked in the 1990s on a regional fair housing bill with the Realtors, and with their support, we were able to achieve an important change in the state law that helped stabilize older suburbs. I also come from a family of Realtors. My father was a Realtor, my grandfather was too, and I understand the profession very much. I understand how much you know. I'm going to talk to you about trends, but I'm sure that everything I am telling you is things that you know in some ways better than I do. The topic that I've been assigned to talk to today is about changing racial diversity in the Chicago suburbs, some of the effects of racial segregation in the suburbs, some of the effects on different forms of discrimination in terms of what happens to markets, housing values, apartment values, and changes that occur there. I'm going to show some slides, so I'm going to share the screen here, and let's see if I think you can see this now. I hope this is a pretty good picture, but I'm going to show some slides. I'm going to talk about the diversity of Chicago's suburbs and talk about it in terms of national trends. I think there's a sense in the United States, at least in the political class, that the central cities are poor and minority, and the suburbs are all white and affluent. And I think everyone that actually works in the suburbs knows that that's not exactly true. Big parts of the suburbs are racially diverse, particularly the first and second ring suburbs. And there are twice as many Americans that live in suburbs that are between 20 and 60% minority citizens as there are in suburbs that are less than 30% minority, predominantly white suburbs. So the shorthand of this is there's twice as many people that live in racially diverse suburbs in the United States. They have twice as many legislators. They have twice as many congressmen as live in majority white suburbs. And in fact, if you're thinking about the suburbs, you're not thinking about a big white entity. You're thinking about various different kinds of suburbs. Some are racially integrated. About 10% live in suburbs that have resegregated and become predominantly non-white. And some are, and there's always a number of growing new communities that tend to be whiter at the edge of metropolitan areas. Now, one of the things that happens as minority families move into the suburbs is there's a sorting process. Minority families that live in the suburbs don't have access to the same kind of credit that white households have. A black family in the United States that earns $167,000 a year is less likely to qualify for a prime loan than a white family that earns $40,000. And that big difference in ability to achieve a loan has a big effect on where minority, non-white families have a chance to live in the suburbs. So I'm going to show you some slides. Let's see if I can get this. Let's see. I'm trying to advance. There we go. So this is, oops. So I go this way. Here's a picture of the Chicago region in 1990. And if you take a look at this slide, obviously the central city is Chicago, and you can see there's about 425 municipalities that surround the central cities. On this slide, if you take a look at the communities, if they're red, they're predominantly non-white suburbs. So you can see some of the suburbs to the south, like Harvey and Markham, down there in 1990 that were predominantly non-white. You can see many of the first and second ring suburbs This is in 1990, that are between 20 and 60% non-white. Now, 90, take a look at 2000. So you see a whole big group of predominantly non-white suburbs of the south side of Chicago, about 28 suburbs, Chicago Heights, Madison, which became a non-white suburb. You can take a look at Calumet City and Dalton and Riverdale. You can see Cicero, obviously, and Summit. And you can see in the far north, you can see Waukegan and North Chicago. So in 1990, they were diverse. In 2000, they became predominantly non-white. So this is 2010. Look at the big change that happened in 2010. So you see a big swath of the western suburbs. You see another 20 or so suburbs that were integrated become majority non-white. And you see this ring of racial diversity moving far out into the western Cook County and DuPage County. You see that most of the communities in DuPage County are either predominantly non-white or racially diverse, with a few exceptions. Now, here's 2013 to 2017. So you see another 7 or 8 groups of suburbs that become majority non-white, and you see a larger ring of diversity on the west side. So this is a huge change that's happened in these 30 years, very different than you would think about the suburbs in the 1960s, when Martin Luther King was here demonstrating for open housing on the south and west sides of Chicago. Now here's a picture. If you take a look at Gary, Indiana, you can see a lot of the communities around Gary. There's a lot of non-white communities in that area, and you can see further out. Now, one of the things that's important to think about is these goals of racially diverse suburbs were one of the goals of Martin Luther King and the Fair Housing Act, that Black and Latino people would have a chance and a choice to live in the suburbs, and they have. More than half of Black families, more than half of Latino families live in the suburbs. If you take a look at Black and Latino families that earn more than the median income, about 2/3 live in the suburbs. If you look at African American and Latino families that are married families with children and have residential choices, it gets close to 80%. Now, as they seek the suburbs, for a variety of reasons, they have different choices than whites of similar income, education, and credit history. One of the things I said, they don't have access to the kind of mortgage money that white families have with the same income, education, and credit history. They don't have the kind of social networks to tell them about the housing that is available in whiter communities. And oftentimes, they are not given the same kinds of choices that white families of similar education, income, and credit history have. And these all result in a pattern of racial segregation. The good news about these racially diverse suburbs is there's lots of good things happening in them. There are smaller disparities on the basis of race in these racially diverse suburbs than there are any place in the country. So people do better, and people do better more equally. Almost all of the non-white college kids in the United States from metropolitan America come from the school districts in these suburbs, which are racially diverse. Race relations, are not perfect anywhere, but whites and non-whites tend to feel more comfortable living and working with each other. People that live in these suburbs, they tend to have less stereotypical views of the other race. And you can say pretty firmly that race relations between whites and non-whites in these suburbs are better than they are almost anywhere in the country. These suburbs tend to do a pretty good job, with exceptions, obviously. We all know of those strange exceptions that occur in local government when a bad mayor or some problematic administration come in. But in general, these communities tend to produce a decent level of services at a decent tax rate. So those are the benefits of these places. There's small racial disparities. There's better racial understanding between the races. There's better achievement for the kids. They tend to be good governments that are run well and at reasonable costs. That's the good news. The bad news is because of the continuing forms of discrimination, like mortgage lending, like the choices that families have when they move, like the behavior of newer, whiter suburbs, which tend not to build apartment buildings or allowed for townhomes or quads or affordable housing, by the decisions of individual rental agents and sellers. These suburbs that were once integrated and are kind of the beloved community that Martin Luther King thought about, they don't tend to stay integrated. They tend to have about 10 or 15 years of integration, and you'll see after that time, they move from this green, nice integrated color to this red, segregated color. Now, when the older suburbs of the United States become non-white, they hit very hard times. These older suburbs have very low tax bases. That means they have comparatively high taxes and low services. No matter who you are, if you've got a small tax base, You're going to have a comparatively high tax rate and or poor services. Their commercial centers tend to disappear or become empty. They tend to have vacancy and trouble, and it's very hard for them to revitalize. Many parts of the central cities can revitalize. There are parts of the west side of Chicago that things are looking up. I went to law school on the south side of Chicago in the late 80s, and when I go back and look at the south side of Chicago coming down from the Loop, it's very different than it was when I was in law school in Hyde Park in 1985 and 86. There's a lot of redevelopment. Central cities have a capacity to gentrify and redevelop, and a lot of that gentrification is very positive. It's what I call urban racial reintegration. If you think the suburbs and certain white suburbs need to be diverse, there are poor neighborhoods of the central cities that need to have a variety of races and incomes too to be sustainable. Central cities have culture and arts and amenities and centrality, and they have some good housing stock that was once upper middle class that's really prone to revitalization. When poverty and instability hits the post-World War II suburbs, which were built on tract housing in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, there's not much to revitalize around. There's not much. There's not the parks, the amenity, the centrality, the culture, the services. And when they get poor and when they become non-white because of discrimination and disinvestment, they stay that way in a much more fundamental way. And that's a bad thing. It's a bad thing for those communities. It's a bad thing for the homeowners. It's a bad thing for the real estate agents. It's a bad thing for everybody. When they move into resegregation, prices go down, markets change, markets become not as strong as they used to be. And the real estate agents that represent those areas don't have the same kind of book of business they once had. They have the same opportunities. These suburbs that are green, a lot of times, they're in the process of change, and credit begins to dry up. There's not the kind of demand, there's not the kind of services, and these markets are not what they ought to be. And when Black and Latino families can't access prime credit, it means that real estate agents who want to sell houses can't sell houses. And every time one of those Black or Latino families doesn't get a loan that they ought to get based on their credit history and income, that means a real estate agent doesn't get a commission. So let's take a look at what these communities are like, some of the data from them. We took a look at 2000 in terms of the suburbs. Central cities were about 32%. Predominantly white suburbs were 33%. The diverse suburbs were 25%. If you move to 2013 to 2017, the diverse suburbs go up from 25% of the population to 37% of the population, much bigger territory. You look at the median income of the central cities, it's $52,000. The diverse suburbs, it's about $70,000. The predominantly white suburbs, it's $47,000. So it's lower than the central cities. If you take a look at the predominantly white suburbs, $90,000, so quite a bit higher. Exurbs, which are places growing at the edge, about $65,000. We didn't talk about them quite as much. You take a look at the central cities, lots of jobs per resident in 2015, 49%, the diverse suburbs, 38%, predominantly white suburbs, small share of jobs, 31%, predominantly white suburbs, 32%. But these diverse suburbs still have a lot of jobs, although things are changing. Poverty rate, central city, 21%, diverse suburbs, 7%, predominantly non-white suburbs, 18%. And as they stay non-white, that poverty rate goes higher and higher. If you take a look at the tax capacity, and this is one of the things that's important, central cities have 92% of the region's tax capacity. They're about average, generally. If you take a look at the diverse suburbs, a little bit higher than the central cities, but not much different. But look at the tax capacity of the non-white suburbs, 41%. And usually as they move from integrated to non-white, they lose their tax capacity very fast, which creates a spiral for them. It means that every year they're losing tax capacity. Services get worse and or taxes get higher. So these predominantly non-white suburbs say, hey, middle-class families and businesses, please come and buy a house here, start a business here. We can tax you at a higher rate every year and spend less on you. Where the predominantly white suburbs can say, hey, families or middle-class businesses, if you can afford the price of a house out here, we can tax you at a comparatively small rate and spend a lot on your kids. You have these communities where you have high incomes and expensive housing. It becomes a no-brainer. If you've got the ability to buy a house in those areas and you're white, it's a no-brainer. You get lower taxes and better services. You get all the benefits of a region's economy and not as many of the costs. Maybe you have to commute a little bit. So this is a pattern. You start to see the region divided against each other, but most people are hurt. If you take a look at the diverse suburbs where 37% of the people live, unless something happens, they're going to move to this predominantly white status, predominantly non-white status. Central cities are kind of where they are, and the older, poorer, non-white suburbs are going to become poorer and poorer and poorer, and larger scale. You can see them moving from 10 to 20 to 57 communities just in the course of 15 years. We're going to take a look at neighborhoods, some of the transition that occurs before this. And these are neighborhoods, the red ones are areas that are predominantly non-white. They are segregated, very segregated neighborhoods. You can see the south and west sides of Chicago. You can see diverse neighborhoods. You can see the suburbs. Now, neighborhoods at a finer grain, this is a finer grain of looking at this. This is 1990. You can take a look at 2000. You can take a look at 2010 and 2013. You see this predominantly non-white category moving into the suburbs, and as you have segregation and poverty are sadly correlated in the United States. When a neighborhood or a school system is black, it tends to be overwhelmingly poor. White poor people tend to find the nooks and crannies of affordable housing in middle-class neighborhoods and middle-class schools. Black and Latino poor families, because of the variety of stresses and strains and forms of discrimination, tend not to have the same choices to find middle-income neighborhoods, and it hurts them in the long term. Take a look at Chicago's schools. You can see these are elementary schools. The red ones are more than 92% non-white. Oops, it's going a little bit. And then you can see that those schools reach much farther out into the suburbs than the diverse schools, than the diverse communities. A lot of times you see racial change, and I know real estate agents don't need to be told this, but you see racial change in the schools a generation, at least a decade before you see it in the community at large. And a lot of times when those schools start to become diverse, markets start to change in terms of housing, even if the schools are pretty good. There was a documentary in the 1990s about the suburb of Madison, Illinois, and they were talking about the changes that were occurring in the real estate markets as fewer white people were interested in buying there. And they talked to the white people that were interested in buying in Madison, which was becoming diverse. And at the time, this was in the early 90s, the diversity was middle class and upper middle class black families, families that were teachers and government employees and principals and doctors and lawyers. And as these families moved into Madison, at the time the market started to change, the black families were actually a little higher socioeconomic status than the white families were. One of the things that white families were saying about that time is they thought the schools weren't as good in Madison as they had been. And Tom Brokaw, who was doing the documentary, went back and looked at the test scores, and the test scores were good in Madison. In fact, they were as good as they'd ever been, and there were more National Merit Scholars that year than there ever had been, 2 of whom were black. They went to talk to the buyers, and they said, what's going on in Madison? They said, the crime rate's going up in Madison. We think the crime rate's going up in Madison. Well, Tom Brokaw looked at the police department and the FBI, and the crime rate was pretty good in Madison. Actually, it was a little bit better than it had been before. So sometimes when things begin to change in a community, and you can see Madison now as one of these non-white suburbs. You all know about this more than I do. But these changes start to happen even for no good reason, just on the basis of race, generations before they have to. Let's take a look at the schools. Now, these are schools that are changing, and you can have all these maps. I'll give them to you, and you can take a look at them and kick the tires of them. But these red schools that are changing 14 points in a 5-year period, 14 to 38 points in a 5-year period, you can see them in the second and third ring of suburbs. There are 95 schools that are changing between 14 and 38 points in race in a 5-year period. That's fast. I study the whole country, and in the Chicago suburbs, these schools in the suburbs change faster. The communities tip faster than any place I've ever seen. Atlanta maybe is pretty close. But you can see that you've got 95 schools that are changing. You got another 284 schools that are changing between 8 and 14 points. And when these schools tend to become minority fast, it has to do with who's being shown the houses, and who's gotten credit, and a lot of things that are happening. But these schools are going to have big effects on the future of the community. Here's free lunch. And one of the things, you look at race in the United States and you're looking at poverty. That's a sad fact. That's a sad part of our history, that when you have a school that's overwhelmingly poor in the United States, the odds are it's going to be overwhelmingly black and or Latino. If you're a poor black or Latino in the United States, 3/4 of poor black and Latino kids go to schools that are overwhelmingly poor. 3/4 of poor white kids go to schools that tend to be middle class. And that's unfair, but that's the way it is. It creates big disparities in educational opportunity. Here's the change in poverty. And again, you can see schools changing. You got 167 schools changing between 19 and 69 points in terms of poverty in 5 years. Again, Chicago beats everybody in the speed with which these second and third ring suburbs turn over. So I'm going to show. These are all the slides I wanted to show you, and I'm going to stop the sharing and get back to my feed. But what does this all mean? Well, it means that there's a lot of things that are happening here in Chicago that are hurting the real estate agents. Big parts of Chicago, the real estate markets aren't what they ought to be. They don't have the demand, they don't have the credit that they ought to have. Real estate agents who spent their life mastering those markets, understanding every nook and cranny, aren't getting the kind of commissions they ought to get, aren't having sales they ought to get. And I know things are going well now, and God bless the real estate industry. I hear everything's going well. God bless it. But if credit were right and if things were doing better, there'd be more credit, there'd be more buyers, there'd be more value in those older suburbs. Every time a black family that earns $167,000 doesn't get a loan, when a white household with the same statistics at $40,000 can get a loan, that's money out of your pockets. And things need to happen to make that better. We need to think about whether we want to just take these older communities and throw them away, let them go through the pattern of integration and segregation and disinvestment and becoming a lower status community, not very valuable, not worth very much. We want to think about what kind of things we can do to help. Now, places that have good, strong, fair housing laws, where everybody gets equal choices, everybody gets equal access to credit, where the newer, whiter suburbs build a little bit of affordable housing, where the central city neighborhoods get some help in gentrifying in the appropriate way. Now, I think gentrification can be a really good thing. If it's all white people and push all the poor people out of the neighborhood, that's not a good thing. But if it's a poor neighborhood that becomes racially diverse and mixed income, that's a good thing. That's what civil rights wants to do. You want to make sure that people have a right and a choice to live in every neighborhood, and every neighborhood is a good place that's got middle-class people and good schools in every neighborhood, and you want to see that happening. You take a look at what's happening in the south and west sides of Chicago, and by and large, you want to make sure that continues to happen. You want to make sure there's affordable housing in those neighborhoods, but you want to make sure those markets get stronger and provide more credit and turn the tide a little bit. You like to think about some mechanisms to keep these older suburbs from tipping so fast. And there's lots of things you can do that. You can work on marketing these suburbs, particularly to certain economic groups in certain geographic areas. You can work about making sure there isn't panic selling or bad rumors like were happening in Madison, Illinois, to all those white families who didn't understand how good the schools were in Madison, didn't understand how low the crime was. You also can think about patterns where every community has to do their fair share of affordable housing, so that not just the poor communities of the south or inner west side have to do it all, but everybody does a little bit. If everybody does a little bit, you don't get segregation and nobody is overwhelmed by the problems. You want to have everybody do a little bit. You want to encourage the urban racial reintegration of neighborhoods. You want to encourage the racial powerful redevelopment of suburbs, so that we're the beloved community that exists in all those green suburbs, those 200 green suburbs that are diverse, that they stay green this decade, the next decade, and the decade after that, that they stay beautiful integrated communities where people of all races and incomes desire to live, where the markets are strong, where credit's available, and real estate agents get rich. I think that this is what we want to think about. We want to think that what we've been doing with 430 cities and 430 school districts, all fighting amongst each other without a common plan. In lots of ways, it's in helping most of real estate agents, most of the communities. And if we could work together a little bit on sharing the burden, making sure things are fair, we can make sure that all these suburbs are green and stay green forever. And this requires some work. Now, one of the reasons I'm talking to you is not only because my father's a real estate agent, my grandfather's a real estate agent. I know when I was in the legislature, if you worked with real estate agents, things could happen. You're a powerful, powerful force in Illinois and a powerful, powerful force in the United States. I don't think in state legislators there's any force in the legislature that's as powerful as the Realtors or the builders, and particularly when they're working together. And one of the things that's happening right now is the fair housing laws of this country are being challenged. They want to abolish them. They say that the fair housing laws in this country seek to destroy the suburbs, that fair lending and fair choices and getting rid of exclusionary zoning and requiring a few apartment buildings here and there, that's going to wreck the suburbs. Well, I don't think that's true, and I think you know that it isn't true. You can see that most of the suburbs are already diverse, and the only way they're going to stay diverse and healthy is a strong fair housing rule of law, where everybody plays fair, where credit's fair, where the newer, whiter suburbs have to help a little bit, where urban redevelopment can be fostered. One of the things in America we see that we continue to build outward. We build more and more acres into the farmland and beyond, build new suburbs, new housing markets, and we take suburbs that we spent billions of dollars in public infrastructure to develop with streets and water and sewers and parks, and we just throw them away. That can't be good for anybody. It can't be good for any taxpayer. It can't be good for the people that live there. It can't be good for the real estate agents there. And it can't be good for the region to build a whole new ring of suburbs without a whole new ring of people. Chicago's not growing that fast. A lot of the Midwest isn't. It'd be nice if it could take those communities that people grew up in and keep them strong and vital and full of demand. So, professor who used to be a politician, former Chicagoan, loved Chicago. I'd like to see things go better in Chicago. This transition that's happening in these first and second ring suburbs is not good for real estate agents. It's not good for anybody else. It's not going to change unless the real estate agents decide that they can use their expertise and strength to make things better. I think making things better and fairer is good for the region, and I think that there's nobody more well-equipped and understand this better than the real estate agent. So you have now I'm a professor, used to be a politician, which is two reasons that I talk too long. So I'm going to slow down in my speech, and I'm going to stand ready for questions. And I, again, am grateful to be here. I'd be happy to help you, to work with you. I'd be happy to talk about the data or the trends. I worked on the fair housing rules for President Obama. I'm presently working as a consultant to the White House, the present White House Council on Affordable Housing. So in the Trump administration, I've worked in both administrations. I've had a long history in these issues, and I've worked with lots of real estate agents and developers for 20 years in different states, and when I was in politics too. So again, I'm proud to be here, and I hope you were able to hear all this. I hope I didn't talk in a bad technical connection, and I hope that we can interact a little bit and talk a little bit about the things I've showed you. So at that point, I think I'll yield the floor.